Welcome back everyone to another chess video. Here we have something that's a little bit tricky to describe, but basically we'll be showing how we'll kind of be making use of our opponent's moves, even though we're not necessarily punishing or exploiting them outright. It's a lot easier to show with real life examples, such as the game that we played here. Okay, so this game begins with e4, I play c6 to Carol Khan. I used to play e5 against e4, but I've changed my repertoire a few years back. They play d4, d5, all very common. We have the advanced variation with e5. Bishop f5, super popular. And very normal developing moves that are very common opening theory, I'm sure, for most players who are familiar with these types of setups. Now in this line I choose this one, with bishop captures, queen captures, and then this queen check. And the idea is that after they play a move like c3, we'll bring our queen back to a6, and we're already giving them some problems. It looks like black is trying to play for an endgame, but that's not really necessarily the case. Now, if the queens do come off, of course this is completely fine for black. I'll show that our knight here isn't so terrible on the edge of the board, so this pawn could be advanced supported by the knight, or in some lines this knight might even relocate itself back to c7 and get back into play that way. And in the meantime, black has really good pawn structure. Now, let's take a look at what happens if they don't trade queens. Because if they don't trade here, it's actually not so easy. Because as soon as they leave this diagonal with their queen, now white can no longer castle. And it might take some time to try and relocate a piece, like get this knight back here to e2 or something, and then kind of use like interference to try and castle, but that thing is much more time consuming, and black isn't just going to sit back into nothing. Now in the game, my opponent played queen to e3, which kind of tells me that maybe they're not as well versed in theory, and that's probably a slight advantage to me. Now, by no means did I play this game perfectly, but we'll see a really good practical sense of how you can take advantage of some of their moves. And that's really the heart of this video. Because what you want to do is give your opponent a few chances to go wrong, but you don't want to be playing for silly one-move traps. You want to be playing moves that are also good for your position, even if they hadn't put their piece on that square. So now white is going to have a little bit more trouble castling, and black, of course, wants to keep developing themselves. So I play knight to e7. Now, knight e7 I like a lot here because we are actually trying to exploit where their queen has been located. Now, I could have played other developing moves. You can see from the engine here that it recommends knight to d7, which objectively, sure, few centipawns better. But I like this knight because we have a very practical plan to try and take advantage of their queen being on e3. And that plan is very often my knight will want to come to f5 in these positions. That'll help put pressure on the center, especially with the c5 move. But here, this comes to really strong effect because the knight would also be attacking their queen. And so that's why I choose to start with the knight in this line. If their queen was not on e3, I might choose to start with something else like knight to d7. So they move the queen, and now I think a little exploitatively again, where I'm thinking, okay, well, my knight wants to go f5 anyway, and I really like that square because this bishop is still free to develop. This pawn will be defended by our knight, and if we can have this f5 knight anchored here, then we'll have really strong pressure on their center. So how would I anchor this knight? Well, it's very common that in many lines we'll play pawn to h5 simply to deter them from playing g4 and kicking our knight away. We can see by the evaluation on the left that it's really pretty close to even, but practically speaking, I think black already has a small advantage, and that's the kind of thing that we'll see time and time again in this video, and I hope you can start working into your own games. Because it isn't good enough to simply develop your pieces and ignore completely what your opponent does. If you know opening theory, yeah, those moves might be common if your opponent also play those lines. But if your opponent puts their pieces on suboptimal squares, you might have better places for your pieces to capitalize on their errors. Now here, both of us continue to make mistakes for the rest of the game. By no means is this game perfect. My accuracy was only in the 70s for this game, which for my level isn't quite abysmal, but it is not so good. But the reason I want to turn off the engine lines here is not because I want to hide the mistakes, but because they'll give a real practical sense where you'll see I never really lose the advantage, even if my moves are not objectively best or my opponent's. So now in this position, my opponent actually played a move that I think is very natural, the computer doesn't like, and again, more reason that I've turned off the engine lines for this part, because I think it's very natural to develop something like knight to d2. But the computer actually doesn't really like that move, because they actually believe that their queen is really misplaced, and the top engine move here is actually queen back to d2. We play bishop to e7, which is the very natural idea where we probably wanted to put this bishop anyway. I mean, literally all of these squares are controlled by their pawns. And so just by process of elimination, our bishop probably belongs on that square. But we're also gaining time kicking back their queen. They go queen g4, and now remember what I said just a few moves ago? We were discussing about the h5 pawn move for black. And so here, although it is not objectively best, again, the computer kind of fails us here in practical sense, because it says c5 is a few centi pawns better. But really c5, although is good, I kind of like my move, which is h5, the second best move, because it's a little more exploitative in taking advantage of where their queen is located. Now this is useful because that's a move that I would have wanted to play anyway, and so we're slowly trying to make use of where opponents' mistakes have been. Even if objectively their queen move actually wasn't too bad. So they move their queen over, and now I play for c5. They have to bring their knight back. We trade here on d4, and they actually took back with the knight. So now taking on d4 with my knight is actually more of an option here, because one could make the argument that if I capture this way, they're helping to get their center back intact. Whereas if I don't capture on d4, then I can just develop something like knight to c6, put pressure on this central pawn, and white is really missing the fact that they lack a d-pawn. And although that was one option that I considered in the game, I actually chose a slightly different route. And I was thinking, well, I can trade on d4, and in doing so, capture back the pawn to maintain their pawn structure, then I will gain this square for my bishop. And this is what I went for in the game. But I also want to bring our attention to another possibility the computer actually pointed out, just to really highlight how exploitative the computer can be sometimes. Because in this position, the very best move is actually to play pawn g5, which is really interesting that your king is now exposed on the king side because of the two pawns advanced in the h and g file, but also we're exposed on the queen side here because we really only have these two pawns to shelter. And so it makes you wonder where black is really intending to castle, if at all. But if you're not a bot who can hold your king in the center with all the little nuances, then keeping your king with castling options is probably the better practical choice. Now I do decide to take on d4. They actually took back the queen and not the pawn. Maybe they kind of sensed my idea, and in exchange for not having the better pawn structure with supporting their center, I guess they really wanted to keep control over the b4 square. Now I'll just show real briefly, if they had captured here, I was intending ideas like this. They go here, I'll just continue developing, and although black is not as good as they could have been earlier, they still have a decent advantage here. But now let's return to the game, and once again trying to exploit where their queen is located, we'll play knight to c6. Now after all of these moves, we can see that black is not that much better. We're only -1 or so here. So, we're a smidge better, a slight advantage. So I don't want this to seem like we're overwhelming them here. But these slow little moves add up, and I'm playing very natural moves that I would have otherwise had played. They go back to e3. I move my queen a little bit more centralized. They bring their knight also a little more to the center. And now here comes actually a fairly critical moment in the game, I think, where I'm at the decision of where to put my king. My king is uncastled in the center right now, perhaps slightly vulnerable long term, and so if I don't want to leave it in the center, which side should I be castling? Now almost always in the Caro-Kann here, and similar positions, we're castling kingside, and the fact that we've advanced our h-pawn is actually not that big of a deal here. But in this case, I actually noticed something that's kind of unique, and that's that I noticed in this case I really want to advance this d-pawn, and so putting a rook on d8 is a very natural idea to do. But the question is, do I want the rook just to move to d8 on its own, or do I want to castle queenside, and then the rook gets to d8 in one move as well? And so almost never would you want to be castling queenside here, because on the queen side you have this vulnerable pawn. But in this unique case, I think that actually my king might be safer on the queen side than it is uncastled in the center. And so I take the risky idea, and I play castle queenside, which the computer actually approves of as a pretty decent move. And now they play b4, which is really an error that probably will cost them the game. It just simply makes d4 much stronger now. I do find d4. I capture on b4. They block the bishop. We trade on d2. And then I simply win material. And although black is doing well here, after queen c2, queen captures e5 check, knight e2, I think I actually chose the wrong route of attack. See, the decision now is which file is more important for black. And so is that the e file, putting pressure on this knight and their uncastled king? Or is it actually the D file and using that open file? Now in the game, I actually thought that this move would be better and playing on the E file, because in doing so, if they ever castle, then we simply win the piece. And that kind of keeps their king forever stuck in the center. And although objectively that's still winning, it is actually better to just simply play on the D file. Now keep in mind that this knight is still pinned, so our D4 rook is not hanging. But I guess rook h to d8 was better because I can add more pieces to the d file. Whereas after this, what we see in the game, I only had really the 2 pieces and didn't really have an easy way to bring the rook on h8 to the e file. So by no means was this perfect, but it gives a really good example of what practically could happen in the game for both sides going slightly wrong. So I play here, and now we'll play some very natural moves here. Kind of go by these a little briefly because they're not really the focus of the video. Just a very slow attack where I'm slowly trying to gain pressure on their king. And of course, white trying to get counterplay on black's king. After these moves here, now we get to an interesting moment, where my opponent captures the knight here, and I realize that maybe this move is actually kind of a waste of time, and maybe I should recapture with the rook. So I do recapture, and although we are still a smidge better because of our material lead of 2 points, white actually has some counterplay, especially if they get a rook to d7, and I'm not actually loving my position here, even if I still think I'm slightly better. So they trade rooks, and then they capture on g7, which according to the engine is actually the best move, so no problems there. But now I think here comes really one of the main keys that I found to really illustrate this concept where we give our opponent chances to go wrong. See, in this position, my king is fairly vulnerable, and there's very obviously going to be either rook to d7 or some type of check by the queen on the back rank. And so what do we do with all of these threats? Well, I probably want to create a luft for my king in either case. And so the question becomes, which pawn do I advance? Now, a lot of players might be looking at the fact that if I push the a pawn and create the a7 as an escape score for my king, then any kind of check here and then queen back will get the queens off the board. And although I'm up by 1 pawn, that looks very tempting, because it looks like this black queen is very menacing on the white king, and maybe they can hold a draw or a better position in a rook endgame. But that's where this really gets interesting, because of course, is that so bad for black? And when I evaluated this in the game, I realized that actually I would welcome that. I think black is actually better in that case. And so I actually played a6, hoping that they give a check on h8, and then come back to d4. Now, just to show what would have happened if they would have captured on f7, or if they would have given a check and then taken on f7, what I was intending here was simply rook c2. And now they just have so many problems here, either on e2 or f2, and I don't think they can hold off checkmate. And so they play the queen check on the square I was hoping for. Move my king to a7, slightly safer. And now they actually fall for it, where they actually do play the move. And once again, I didn't play it perfectly here, but I did maintain my advantage for the rest of the game. Where after the queen trade, I chose to go rook to c2. And I thought, I'm up a pawn. If they ever advance this pawn, I can get my rook behind the pawn, and I can just play the slow endgame grind where I am up a pawn. I'm going to be better, especially with these 2 connected pawns that are unopposed on the queen side. But actually better than that was to play this rook check first. And then when their king comes up, now I play this move with check, and I'm just picking up the pawn for free. But alright, no one's perfect, we missed those things. They play a4, I play my rook a2 plan. And then we play the regular endgame where I slowly bring my pieces up, capture that pawn, and now these 2 pawns are going to be very strong. Play a few moves here. And I am not worried in the least with them pushing their h-pawn. I can always stop it by bringing my rook around. So I play this check, they come up, and then I go here. They push their pawn, and now I push b2. And if I ever lose this pawn in exchange for this pawn, especially if the rooks come off, then this a6 pawn is simply going to promote all the way into a queen. They try and get behind my pawn, but now comes a very common tactic I'm sure many players are familiar with in the endgame, where I capture an h7, and they really don't want to take my rook because then I'll just promote into a queen. And if they keep their rook on the b file, well then I've just simply won this pawn. So they do end up capturing. I get a queen. Just have to avoid the checks. This is the moment where I actually missed, like, immediately after we moved. I realized that, yeah, this would have probably won the game on the spot. But right after I played A5, then I saw it and it's like, okay, things happen. So we start dodging some checks again. Once again, there was this move that I missed, but we are winning either way. King comes up. Several moves go by. We finally pick up the rook, and now the game is going to be decided here. Where after this move, they resigned. But it gives you a good practical sense of what can happen when one side sets a few traps for the opponent. It wasn't really that it was one move threats, but it's just small little places where they could go wrong. I think this moment was a highlight of such example, where I realized that queen d4 is actually not a threat. And because I evaluated that correctly, that was a big part in me winning this game. And so although this might be a fairly simple concept for most advanced players, I think a lot of intermediate players, and perhaps even some beginning players, should be able to benefit a lot from this video. And it's my hope that even some of the advanced players might look at this concept in a slightly different lens. Not always do you just completely crush your opponent in some exploiting outright thing, just like all of the textbook examples. In those situations, those are pinnacle examples where one game really highlights something and the opponent crumbles. But in real games, they don't always crumble so quickly. I mean, that's why those games are so special, and why those master games are the ones recorded. Because they have that very cool ending that is not common. In most games, you're going to have a very small advantage. Like if we go back to the opening here, after queen e3, this is very minuscule, and even though we're playing very logical moves, continuing to make time and attack their queen, we see that like after this move here, black is only like half a pawn better, despite the fact that they've kicked around the white queen so many times. And most players are not converting half a pawn into a win. Even title players often have trouble converting something like half a pawn, if their opponent's resistance is strong enough. But those small edges add up, and I would much rather have that little advantage than to not have it. So make sure to keep on the lookout and just not develop your pieces robotically. On the contrary, you should be very active and always be looking for opportunities to slightly take advantage of your opponent's weaker moves. So thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.